Chapter 32. Tiamatu. An ambience of cold and damp footsteps, slowly ascending steps long consigned to oblivion, far from our memories, accompanied by the clanking and dragging of heavy chains, rattling the melancholic melody of bondage against the rhythmic percussion of mucked water droplets. This is the sole phenomenon occupying the unadulterated heed of the whole of Oma. Step, clank, drip, step, clank, drip, and so forth. This was all that the entire world could hear, lest they dare let slip from their clamped lips their own utterances, of which they most certainly refrained, with the greatest of efforts, from doing. It was the full range of what they could fathom, struck by an instinct so gripping that none could slither from it. As the god of suffering nears the doors, which for over a millennia he has only seen the dark sides of, one could hear a new sound breach into his pensive symphony. A faint jumble of screeches, most of which are muzzled and constrained, populates behind the monstrous archway of the dungeon like a crowd of frantic captives. This dungeon was ever present, yet afforded no attraction by the everyday passer-bys who became so accustomed to its being that it may as well have not been there altogether. A numbed desensitization. For the past several decades, in the eyes of the public, it had fallen to the state of a decommissioned prison, or a vermin's glorified crawl-space nestled beneath the city. This is what most Nullartans thought of it, if they thought of it at all. Some pored over it with disgust, signing petitions to refit the structure as a library or museum of some sort due to its location being so near to the heart of the capital. Yes, those who noticed it looked to it as an eyesore. Above it, the citadel of Nullarta sat perched high above the city center, peering down and outward. The unwieldy doors riotously swung open. His arms are thrown wide, his head bowed, his stature demonstrable of divinity and undeniably godlike. Parts of him are shrouded by the shadows of his half-escaped prison, slipping over his shoulders and around his frame. He takes another step forward, lifting his face into Ara's moonlight. The pale god lacks all color aside from within the depths of his icy dead eyes. A faint blue, as if to mock his supremacy of suffering with a hidden hope, clings deep within those wells of despair. His brawn, traced by the shadows, dares any and all who witness it to challenge it aught they possess a flake of courage in its presence. Everything about Tiamatu's being is an appeal for irrefutable dominance. Yet, in the same breath, much of him also says the contrary. He bears scars, cuts, lacerations, and burns throughout his frame. His head, along with the rest of his skin, is void of hair, aside from his busheled snowy eyebrows. His chest does not expand, nor does it contract, leading me to assume he has no need for the snag of mortal breathing. His head wields 6 horns fixed on a spiraling crown, all aimed in their own courses. Even with this extraordinary vision, I can detect no evidence of a heartbeat. An ominous blanket of frost accompanies him. Heavy, dark metal cuffs and chains wrap around his wrists, ankles, and neck. His demeanor speaks volumes. He is nothing if not deliberate. He fixates on the moon, Ara, for he must be pondering about how it shines down in defiance of the shadowy veil which he chokes our world with. His attention wavers from it for just a chance moment when he digests, with his eyes, his own hands in the moonlight, a view that the blackness of his prison had denied him for all that time. He peers again at the guardian moon. 3 packs of wolves, who happen to be in the town center, are the first to observe an immortal deity at their doorstep and in the midst of their precious city. A spear maiden is the first to snap out of the damning paranoia. Gauging Tiamatu's seemingly infinite breadth, she musters the courage to engage first. Such gallantry in the face of the unknown often comes to be recognized for its true self, that being naivete. In times of crisis, the irrational are often the first to perish. Nevertheless, to strum a brighter, more ethereal chord, I remember once being told by my late father that the self-daring naivete of the sheltered will be and ought be broken, and it is for the better, as by consequence it will transform not only the individual, but the world as a whole. I fervently hope that his words bear truth.
On command, inner beast!
She shouts, then assumes a barbarous battle stance, one resembling a wild feline positioned to lunge with her spear and body low to the ground. Her muscles slightly expand, and a coat of bronze fur dresses her anatomy. It's interesting to note that Hakor and I aren't the only wolves capable of hybrid-like transformations. With her spear at hand, she advances on the pale god with a predator's haste. Tiamatu yet has his unfettered focus set on Ara, as though no burden outside of this could bother him for his attention. She capitalizes on the distraction and drives her spear at his abdomen. But Tiamatu, undiverted from the moon, is nonetheless able to meet the spearhead with the tip of his index finger, turning her spear into a pouring black soot as each part, end to end, makes contact and is driven forth. The spear maiden hurries herself to retaliate, spinning into a jumping roundhouse kick to the side of his left elbow, successfully connecting but inflicting no damage. The force, though considerable, does not amount to one which can budge the terrifying deity. She pulls away, noticing her foot has been enveloped with rime, as is the rest of her to a lesser degree, affirming that Tiamatu's aura of frost is not simply for show. At last, he removes his target on Ara and rejoins himself back on Oma, glaring into the soul of the spear maiden. Swifter than one can think, Tiamatu shuts the distance between them in an apparition's shudder. Had I blinked, I would have missed it. He towers in front of her, nearly thrice her size, and just as swiftly as he collapsed the space between them, he lowers himself to meet her, brow to quivering brow.
Have you ever been so hungry?
He stops, his voice heavy and deep, echoes within himself. When he speaks, the screeching of spirits halt themselves as not to anger the god, and they continue again the moment he finishes or whensoever he pauses.
That you would give anything, absolutely anything, for a measly crumb from anyone's scraps, just to take the pain away for a lousy, meager second.
What is he attempting to put forth? Why ask such an arbitrary question? The spear maiden, shivering from both his aura and her fright, cannot bring herself to respond to the god.
Child of mine, I hesitate to say that you have not. I surmise that none of you here have.
He looks around at the crowd of Omani spectators and wolves who've gathered. His eyes glance over their fancy garments and the torch-lit shine of the city.
Privilege. There is nothing intrinsically wrong with it, so long as the carrier knows that which he carries. And yet, ought it be taken away?
He taps her stomach with the same finger that he reduced her weapon to ashes with. Immediately, the warrior falls to the fetal position, kicking and screaming as though parasites have swarmed her insides. Her pleas are unrecognizable and unfitting of a wolf. Saliva drips from the corners of her mouth and snot from the ends of her nostrils, and she cries, "Make it stop." Her eyes bulge out of their sockets whilst she heaves. Each breath afflicts her further, yet she continues to hyperventilate as her only resort. Tiamatu steps away and motions to the crowd surrounding them to participate.
Come, become acquainted with suffering.
Two wolves charge in next, one armed with a spinning ball of wind engulfing his fist, the other with a blade of ice which he materializes by his breath. Tiamatu vanishes into a ghastly shadow and reappears behind the both of them, grabbing hold of their heads and penetrating their minds. Their pupils shoot into the darkness of their skulls. Once released, the two turn their manipulated animosity towards one another. And a bloody synchronicity, a cold blade runs through the heart of one and a shredding wind into the throat of the other. The two warriors were forcibly deranged, yet it is evident by the glimmer of their eyes that in their final moment they were at the very least fortunate to pass into the next life as their true selves. By the individual and by the pack, the wolves assault Tiamatu. An array of abilities, scattered yet combined, meet his undaunted gaze. Those who excel at close quarters are unable to land even a single blow as the god slips in and out of the transitioning shadows. Even now, with 14 wolves all attacking in skillful unison, it is to no avail. The creeping frost sedates their movements. A few well-guided arrows fly into the fray. Tiamatu lifts his cuffs, deflecting them, all whilst maintaining his dance around the frantic ambush.
As expected,
He says. The immortal takes to an explosive flight, ordered in a vertical trajectory. The generated force throws the 4 closest warriors onto their backs. Suspended in flight, hovering over Nalarta's center, Tiamatu speaks again.
I see that I must remind the Omani of our overlapping histories, and of who it is that I am.
His words pour onto the city, carried by the leaden waterfall of his vocal pressure.
Do not forsake yourselves quicker than need be. I am in no rush to undeliver you. However, I shall not do so without first elucidating my reasoning.
His manners are aberrantly polite, and yet his voice and choice of wording is artless and unambiguous. Cutting across the sea, land and mountains by flight is indeed granting me with a much-needed time that would otherwise be renounced. We avoided the peaking ranges by foot whilst on the way here, and that took us weeks in order to spare seasons. Nevertheless, even at this velocity, it does not yet slander the expedition enough. If I cannot be there for my kind, then I will have abandoned them for this journey in vain. Everything will have been for nothing. In my panic, muffled, but nevertheless present, is my former voice. The voice of that young Omanu, who, displeased with his life and lack of meaning, is now drowning in that which he sought. Who could have warned me? Who could have known? I disguised my absence of purpose for an absence of adventure, and now that there is nobody left to fool, that very purpose suffocates me. I cannot remove it, nor can I ignore it. I cannot delegate it, nor can I wish it away.
Sounds as though you yearn to defend, or rather, justify a guilty conscience,
one of the wolves shouts.
Do you take us for imbeciles? Your aura reeks of misery and darkness.
Another from a separate pack yells.
Save your breath, monster,
from the other side of the marketplace.
Monster, you say? Lost ones, I am a god. Have you no recollection of your ancestors' trials? What history is more important than the one that pertains to your species' bout with the god of suffering?
He poses himself in a way welcoming an honest answer. A spear twirls past Tiamatu's skull. He had simply lowered his head by no more than a single digit's length in confidence that it would suffice as an evasion.
It seems that I need remind you, not by speech, but by action.
The pale god breaks the dangling chains linking his cuffs to one another. He inhales deeply, and a mighty wind pulls against everything below him, levitating small stones and loose debris for the duration of his siphon. Tiamatu then exhales with a blustery pressure, but what he exudes is no wind. A tsunami of insects, enough to momentarily cast a shadow against the last bastion of light, blotting the moons, invades the city, infesting its every nook and cranny. The incessant noise of the countless fluttering wings and clicking crawlers drowns out every other sound apart from the collapsing rooftops and cracking roads. As the initial impact settles, their innumerable little legs trample the airways and hearing canals of the wolves and pedestrians alike. The thousands of kalama of distance between my physical form and this heinous scene is not barrier enough for my turning stomach. It is all too nauseating to watch.
Command, psychokinesis.
A new voice breaks in, calm and collected. An enormous bale of the insects is gathered and carried off by will of some invisible authority. I scan the area with my Draken's eye view. There! He kneels at the edge of the overhang upon a lopsided herbal and medicinal outlet. I know that wolf. No, more accurately, I know of that wolf. Levizo, the mover. It is about time an alpha arrived. One had to show up sooner or later. We are fortunate it is him, specifically. Levizo's abilities are a perfect counter to Tiamatu's vermin swarm. He motions by snapping his wrist leftward and launching the compact bevy of insects across the map and safely from the city. Tiamatu and Levizo move to meet on the surface, the god nimbly lowering his levitation whilst the alpha zooms to his descent.
Wolves! Stand guard, but refrain from interfering. This is an alpha-level threat. Secure your positions and await instruction until additional alphas arrive.
Levizo directs the warriors yet left standing. Many have survived and even secured the lives of the less capable, putting on display the skilled competency of the Nalartan wolves. In the background, a muffled cry for food escapes from underneath the rubble where the famine-inflicted Omana still tosses in pain. Amongst her, other victims lay lifeless, with the leftover scouring insects devouring their fresh corpses. Tiamatu stares expressionlessly at his opponent. Levizo's adroit solution to resolving the infestation fails to elicit any sense of awe from the god. Levizo makes the first move, employing his commanding psychokinesis to compress a hefty detached doorway and a large felled tree into each other, using the god as their point of convergence. Tiamatu, however, makes no effort to dodge. The Alpha squeezes and compacts the object into a dense sphere and drops it back onto the road, which folds under the sheer weight of the object. His psychokinetic abilities are comparable to Saba's vibrational prowess. Nevertheless, Saba possesses the aptitude to compress layers with a considerably denser firmness. Although one must note that the barter between the two is that Saba requires the mediums he manipulates to be in contact with each other, whereas Levizo may grasp at anything that meets his eye. The surrounding Omani cheer auspiciously, as though the battle is resoundingly concluded in their favor. I, however, know all too well that an adversary of this caliber is not so easily overcome.
Val is no god. Was that fool trying to assume the role of Tiamatu? From the old faith books. Children's tales. The fool thought himself to be a part of the Pinnacle Three. Ha! Tiamatu, god of suffering. Ninmare, goddess of joy. Yalum, god of balance. What a farce!
The wolf condescendingly hollers within his banter. They truly do not believe in our greatest legends. That quote that has visited me in dream and then in waking, it was of my ilk. They know not who it is that they mock. The taunting and chafing grows amongst them. Levizo, however, does not celebrate. His gaze has yet to leave the ball of wood and stone that he had molded around the enemy in hopes of crushing him. Reinforcements have arrived. Another Alpha joins Levizo's side, one I do not recognize. Regardless of his identity, this provides some relief. Last I researched, there are roughly 300 Alphas in our ranks, with 40,000 wolves in total. An Alpha, at the bare minimum, is generally worth 10 lower wolves in battle. Contending with 2 of them by oneself ought not prove to be an elementary task for any adversary, god or otherwise.
What are we dealing with here? A Tomas general? A crafty raiding party?
The ebon-maned Alpha inquires, displaying an air of juvenility and inexperience. When examining him closer, he appears to be nearly a decade younger than me.
He is certainly not of Tomas origin. Do not underestimate him, Toya.
Levizo warns. Toya? Toya? Toya! The Toya! The youngest wolf to graduate to rank Alpha in all of our history? So that's him, huh? He ranked into his Alpha position at the age of 12. And that was 3 years ago? Judging from his unfulfilled frame and boisterous body language, he is yet very immature. This is the very last place he ought to be, regardless of his accolades. That fickle reassurance I formerly held just moments ago begins to evaporate. Abruptly, 16 onyx-black chains burst from the core of the condensed matter, grabbing hold of and latching on to the toppled buildings. The bricked road, and just about any solid structure the chains may chance coming into contact with. Tiamatu floats his ephemeral jail of splinters and steel and hastily spins it, ripping anything that the chains had hooked into from their foundations and into a twister of metal, clay, and stone. The wolves anxiously defend themselves, but many are pummeled and shredded through by chain and rock. Levizo and the young Alpha barely evade and back away from the tornadic reach. The Prior focuses his ability in slowing the rapidly revolving sphere, and he is successful in doing so.
Toya! No! Hit him with everything you got!
He vociferates in his distress. But there are yet Omani around, Toya nervously responds.
Never mind that! We shall not be afforded this opportunity again! Hurry!
Levizo's mental grip is loosening. The young Alpha hesitates, but not for long, electing to obey Levizo, despite his preceded grief for those that may be caught in the sightline of his fire.
Command! Celestial blaze!
A bright white light fills Toya, the rays escaping through his nostrils, mouth, and ears. His hair flows upward, now a luminous white, as though draped by some unseeable force. And an intense aura of detonates from his stance. He adopts a curious battle position, placing his non-dominant leg forward and pivoting it with his foot, targeting his opponent, leaning slightly onto it. The other leg extends straight behind his torso, which is aligned with the non-dominant leg, blading himself in the face of his opponent. His left fist is clenched in front of him, the other parallel with his unkinked dominant leg. In the latter hand, he has generated a small sphere of light, perfectly contained. In an acute flash that illuminates the entire city and beyond, Toya overhand tosses the globe of effulgent light, pitching it with an excellent precision and speed into Tiamatu's hosting orb. The resulting explosion atomizes the sphere and every structure in a triangular-shaped wave behind it over a Kalama. The number of lives sacrificed in a rash attempt to slay Tiamatu has already grown staggering. I am so sorry it had to be like this. When the resonance of the great flash resides and dims, Tiamatu still stands, now free of his little jail. His head is thrown back, facing a cloudless sky. The clout of the light has eradicated a cone of his foul energy from the atmosphere. Though it is temporary, for I can see the filthy mist casually returning like a curtain shutting around our poor world. His frame is permeated with flash burns, and his stature is skewed from the ripping of particles. Yet he maintains his ground. The hot steam escaping his body becomes dominated by his frozen aura. The immortal soma begins reorganizing itself both internally and externally. The shifting of his ligaments, coupled with a fresh formation of new skin over his old, makes for a horrific sight. It is like watching life defy its final moment, no matter the cost, even if it is one soul that is sacrificed for the defiance. A true rebellion to the harmonious dichotomy of life and death. What we witness is an absolute submission of oneself in exchange for the scarcest resource of all, time. Immortality must have a price. This would expound upon the rusted chains and his tattered attire. He dons no distinguished garments or divine armor that I would expect of a supreme deity. Instead, it is shackles, torn trousers, and naked souls. Truly, he is as though a god of peasants.
The power to wield light as a weapon. Pragmatic. But this, too, cannot eradicate suffering. You have but shone this light upon that which suffers, nothing more.
The renewing Tiamatu speaks this, giving a moment for despair to settle back into its place.
You have overstepped the limitations of your youth in ability and duty, and you would do well to know that the consequence of your failures are not reserved for the adults who may have catered to your past mishaps.
He stares Toya into a fear-induced paralysis.
Toya, run!
Levizo understands the threat that Tiamatu proposes is directed explicitly at Toya, and that he cares not for his underdeveloped age. The pale god shoots another chain through his palm, driving it into Levizo's chest, who intercepts it on Toya's behalf. He clenches the chain and plants his feet firmly.
How mortally predictable. Your altruism was to be expected.
Tiamatu knew Levizo would leap into harm's way for his junior.
Do not dare look down on us.
Levizo's placidity has been vanquished, his outburst both dismal and compelling.
I do the contrary. I do not pity you, for I participate in your suffering. I am one half of all suffering in the realms of mortals, an equal recipient of every woe. I sympathize, truly I do, and I bring the ultimate solution.
Tiamatu's words flow like a thawing river. I believe he means what he is saying. But I can adhere to no justification for his actions. Such a being can leave no stone unturned in his quest to remove the irremovable, a very element of life.
Toya, you've got to escape.
Levizo coughs these words forth, but not before dressing them with his blood. I cannot move. He shivers as he replies. This is perhaps his first encounter with a threat so asymmetrically greater than his natural prodigal capabilities can endow him in defending against. There's also the likelihood that the very death stare of Tiamatu carries a paralytic property. Levizo motions to control the chain within him with his psychokinetic command, but he is unable to do thus. Tiamatu floats his way toward the pair, absorbing the slack in the chain as he approaches.
I have no choice.
Levizo staggeringly sighs. Redirecting his mental force, the pierced Alpha hurls Toya through the air and away from himself in a desperate bid to save the young Alpha. But the vengeful deity reacts with an otherworldly speed, unleashing a second chain that snakes through the air and coils around the soaring Toya's ankle, dragging him back into his clutches. Levizo falls to his knees. Utterly defeated and entirely exhausted, he collapses into his grave. Holding Toya by the skull, clenched in his formidable grip, Tiamatu issues his verdict.
You are a light bringer. I am he who banishes light. For where there is light, there is hope, and darkness awaits at its fringes for the slightest dimming of this fleeting power. It waits, and waits, and waits, until at last it exploits the least of opportunities and exacts suffering. The very nature of life beckons light, and unbeknownst to this, welcomes misery. This is why neither light nor dark ought be permitted domain. They are diametrically opposed, and thus they wage an eternal war, with life itself as their unfortunate battlefield.
What sort of philosophy is this? Is that his endgame? To eradicate all life for the sake of ending suffering? He continues.
However, I will deprive you of your greatest attribute. You must know that this level of suffering endures, and yet is itself unendurable.
With that he releases Toya, but not as to carelessly drop him. No, he lays him down to the ground in a fatherly manner, as though to tuck him into his bed and away for his final sleep. Toya opens his eyes, but his gaze looks through and not upon. Where? Why is it so dark? Toya feverishly feels and pats the ground around him. There's a nervous, wordless plea in his panic. It is visible in all of the wolves present. Alas, my apprehension has been confirmed, for Toya's peering lacks any conviction and has within it no direction. Tiamatu has deprived him of his sight. He has stolen his light.